The year is 1941. Nazi Germany, at the height of its power, unleashes a surprise attack on the Soviet Union. From the chaos and bloodshed, a figure of immense stature emerges, Georgy Zhukov. A brilliant strategist and ruthless tactician, Zhukov would rise to become the Soviet Union's greatest military leader. This is the story of Zhukov, the Iron Marshal, and his pivotal role in shaping the 20th century. Born in 1896 near Moscow, his early life was one of hardship and resilience. In 1915, as the First World War raged, a young Zhukov was drafted into the Tsarist army. His experiences in the trenches of World War I instilled in him the importance of discipline, leadership, and the brutal realities of warfare. These formative years forged within Zhukov the steel that would define his character. The world, however, was yet to witness the full extent of his abilities. The crucible of World War II awaited. The Russian Revolution of 1917 plunged the nation into a bloody civil war. Zhukov, now a hardened veteran, cast his lot with the Bolsheviks and the nascent Red Army. His natural leadership qualities shone through, and he quickly rose through the ranks. Between the wars, Zhukov's star continued to ascend. He embraced new military doctrines, particularly deep operations and armored warfare. Zhukov's dedication did not go unnoticed. He caught the eye of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union's enigmatic and ruthless dictator. Recognizing Zhukov's potential, Stalin appointed him to increasingly important commands. Serving under Stalin's watchful gaze, Zhukov understood the precarious balance between achievement and suspicion in Soviet politics. In 1939, as Europe stood on the brink of war, Zhukov's skills were put to the test far from his homeland. On the plains of Khalkhin-Gol, near the border between Mongolia and Japanese-occupied Manchuria, a border dispute escalated into open warfare. The Japanese Kwantung Army sought a decisive victory. Zhukov, however, had other plans. Appointed to command the Soviet and Mongolian forces, Zhukov faced a formidable enemy. He carefully assessed the terrain and the enemy's tactics, conceiving a daring plan. In August 1939, Zhukov unleashed his counterattack. Waves of Soviet tanks, supported by artillery and air power, smashed through the Japanese flanks. The Kwantung Army was routed, and Khalkhin-Gol was a resounding victory for Zhukov. This clash in Mongolia was merely a prelude to a far greater conflagration. The early hours of June 22, 1941, shattered the uneasy peace in Europe. Nazi Germany launched a massive surprise attack on the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa unleashed the full fury of the Wehrmacht upon an unsuspecting nation. German tanks surged across the border in a lightning war or blitzkrieg, aiming to crush the Red Army. The initial German assault caught the Soviet forces off guard. Years of purges had decimated the Red Army's officer corps. Confusion reigned, and entire divisions were encircled and destroyed. In this hour of crisis, Stalin turned to his most capable commander. Zhukov, then serving as chief of the general staff, was given the monumental task of coordinating the Soviet defense. He issued orders, countermanding disastrous retreats and urging his commanders to fight with every ounce of their strength. Zhukov understood that the key to victory lay in buying time to mobilize the vast reserves of manpower and industrial might. Each day of resistance brought the Germans closer to the logistical breaking point of their invasion. As the summer of 1941 bled into autumn, the German advance continued unabated. The Wehrmacht pushed relentlessly towards Moscow, the Soviet capital. The fall of Moscow, it was believed, would cripple Soviet morale and bring a swift end to the war in the east. Zhukov understood the symbolic importance of Moscow and resolved to defend it at all costs. He ordered the construction of multiple defensive lines employing anti-tank ditches, minefields, and fortified strongpoints. He ensured that his troops were adequately supplied with ammunition, food, and warm clothing. Zhukov's greatest weapon was the indomitable spirit of the Soviet people. He rallied the defenders of Moscow, appealing to their patriotism and hatred of the invaders. When the German offensive stalled in the outskirts of Moscow, Zhukov seized his opportunity. On December 5, 1941, he unleashed a massive counteroffensive. The Battle of Moscow marked a turning point in the war. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, and the Wehrmacht tasted defeat on the Eastern Front. However, the war was far from over. In the summer of 1942, the Germans launched a new offensive targeting Stalingrad. Stalingrad held immense symbolic value for both sides. The fighting raged for months, street by street, building by building. Zhukov, now serving as Stalin's deputy commander-in-chief, played a key role in planning the Soviet defense. He recognized that the Germans were vulnerable to a counteroffensive aimed at their flanks. In November 1942, Zhukov unleashed Operation Uranus. The German Sixth Army, trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad, was slowly encircled and cut off. The German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked a decisive turning point in World War II. The tide had turned, and the initiative now lay with the Red Army. In the summer of 1943, the Germans launched their final strategic offensive in the east, near the city of Kursk. Zhukov anticipated the German plan and convinced Stalin to adopt a defensive posture. The Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, commenced on July 5, 1943. Thousands of tanks clashed in a maelstrom of steel and fire. Zhukov directed the Soviet defense with precision, orchestrating counterattacks and shifting reserves. The Red Air Force pounded German positions and supply lines. After a week of intense fighting, the German offensive was spent. The Battle of Kursk was a decisive victory for the Soviet Union, marking the end of large-scale German offensive operations on the Eastern Front. As the Red Army advanced westward, liberating Eastern Europe from Nazi rule, Zhukov's reputation as a military genius reached its zenith. In the spring of 1945, Zhukov led the final assault on Berlin. The Battle of Berlin was a brutal affair, reducing the city to rubble. On May 2, 1945, the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag, marking the end of the war in Europe. Zhukov, the conqueror of Berlin, had reached the pinnacle of his career. However, even in victory, Zhukov could not escape the shadow of Stalin. The dictator saw Zhukov's popularity as a potential threat to his own power. In the years after the war, Zhukov was sidelined and subjected to constant surveillance. Despite his immense contributions, Zhukov was never fully trusted by the regime he had served so faithfully. Despite his tumultuous relationship with Stalin, Zhukov's legacy as a military commander remained secure. He was one of the most influential military figures of the 20th century. His strategic brilliance and tactical acumen played a pivotal role in shaping the course of World War II. Zhukov's contributions to military science were profound. He was a master of deep operations and maneuver warfare. His emphasis on decisiveness and maintaining the initiative revolutionized Soviet military doctrine. Zhukov's legacy extends beyond the battlefield. He was a complex figure navigating Soviet politics with skill and ruthlessness. He believed in the Soviet Union and its destiny, willing to make immense sacrifices in its defense. While Zhukov's military genius is undeniable, his legacy is not without its critics. Some historians argue that his victories came at a staggering human cost. They point to his willingness to accept heavy casualties as evidence of a callous disregard for the lives of his soldiers. Others criticize his close association with Stalin and his role in perpetuating the Soviet dictator's repressive regime. These criticisms must be weighed against the context of the time. The Soviet Union during World War II was fighting for its very survival. The choices facing Soviet leaders, including Zhukov, were often stark and unforgiving. To defeat the Nazi threat, they believed, required extreme measures. Zhukov was a soldier, not a politician, and his primary focus was always on the battlefield. Georgy Zhukov, the peasant boy who rose to become the Soviet Union's Iron Marshal, died in 1974. He left behind a complex and often contradictory legacy. He was a brilliant military leader, a ruthless tactician, and a loyal servant of the state. Zhukov's story is a reminder of the human capacity for both good and evil, for courage and cruelty. It is a story that continues to fascinate and inspire, to provoke debate and challenge our understanding of the past. In the end, Georgy Zhukov was a product of his time, shaped by the tumultuous events of the 20th century. He was a complex and contradictory figure, but there is no denying his immense impact on history. He was the Iron Marshal, the savior of Moscow, the conqueror of Berlin, and his name will forever be etched in the annals of military history.